Hey guys, welcome back to the next video. In this video, we are going to talk about threads. So just introduction to threads. Just wanna make you understand about threads before going any further down the line. Now that we have completed the installation of your IBM support assistant, now to analyze anything on the support assistant, firstly, we need to understand the basic concept of threads and heap. And then we going to understand the advanced concepts of them. And then we are going to understand and analyze these thread and heap. So it makes sense for you what you're dealing with. Now, firstly, to start with threads, threads are basically the smaller process of your process, JVM process. So nowadays, all the process uses thread for handling the request. But if you talk about a few years back, when you're using Apache HTTP server, there was an option called pre-fork and worker. Now, Apache HTTP server was primarily been operating on pre-fork, which is basically process-based operation. So for every request it handles, it creates a process. So when you type ps-ef grep of HTTP, you will see multiple process depends on the number of requests coming in. Now, a process is like a large threshold. So the process will have a specific memory threshold, and that memory will be directly used by the process. So the process is technically heavier, and a process needs to be closed. Okay. So this means that when you start a process and when you end a process, there's going to be a chunk of memory assigned to it. And more or less, this process is majorly memory based and also CPU based as well, but then majorly it is memory based. So came the worker process in terms of Apache HTTP server, where each process will have a specified number of threads, which is actually handling the request. So rather than the request is assigned to a process, a request will be assigned to a thread. And then each thread will be handling that request. So that's how thread became popular, and threads are basically from your CPU. So how many number of CPUs you're gonna have, that many number of multiplied by 2 will be the threads of it. That's the default number, but it may change. So for example, if I'm running 2-core CPU, then I may have 4 threads. So that's the default number, but then it differs on different scenarios. So if I take this Java process right now, if I take this Java process, which is run by WebSphere, so grep of server 1, so server 1 is a process which I'm running over here. Now this is on a whole is a process. Okay. Now this process will have CPU assigned to it, memory assigned to it, and we call it heap, as in we assign a memory fragment of memory to this particular process, saying that this is your minimum, this is your maximum memory. That's, we call it something called heap in terms of this process. Now, in terms of CPU, we don't assign any specific parameter for the CPU over here, because CPU is dynamic and we don't really assign CPUs for any process for that matter. So how and when the CPU will be utilized is a dynamic process. So when there is a requirement, then the CPU will be utilized for processing. And you know that CPU is nothing but a central processing unit. So if a process needs to be executed, the CPU has to execute it at CPU level. Like for example, ls, when I execute this ls command, this is a process. So ls command temporarily becomes a process, and then the CPU will process this ls command. And then once the process is completed, it will be displaying it out over here. So it will primarily write it to the buffer, memory buffer, and memory buffer will send this output over here to your screen to see the output over here. Now this is how a process is formed, and then a memory is assigned to it. A thread is created out of the process. Thread goes to the CPU, process the data, and then gets you the output of it. The same thing over for process as well, but process is this is a long running process. This is a short running process. Okay. But a long running process like this will not constantly use CPU, because only when there is a requirement for this process to be, to use a CPU, then only it will be used by the CPU. So that means that there are different states to your thread. Okay, so when I say that only when this process needs to be handled, then only it will require CPU, right? But it's not like that. I mean, a thread will be normally created to the CPU. So when the process is started, there is going to be a minimum number of threads which is going to be established with the CPU. Now, that's where the state of thread comes into the picture. There are these runnable threads. There are this inactive threads as well, and there are different states we will talk later. But a runnable thread is a thread which is runnable, but doesn't mean that it is running right now, because if there is no activity from the JVM, there is no thread. So that's currently in a sleeping mode, or currently it is inactive. Okay, so which means that the current thread which has been established is not running. So that means that there could be multiple threads in the process even right now when I'm not accessing this JVM in any point of time. So which means my CPU should be idle. So when I use the top command, you can pretty much see the CPU activity over here. So currently the CPU was really up. What is the usage? The user usage was little up just when I typed the top command, because it was up because of execution of this top command. So the top command took a little bit of CPU, and that CPU is a user CPU. This is a system CPU. Now you can see that the top command is still occupying a bit of CPU over here, and that's basically your user CPU. Okay, so it could be a combination of system and user also. So you cannot say that for sure if it is like definitely the user CPU or system CPU. And then you have the idle CPU over here, which is 98% of my CPU is idle. Okay. Now, on the other hand, the load average tells you the average amount of load. We will not go in that discussion right now. But my Java process over here is currently not so active. As you can see that even though threads have been established, but my CPU has not been working on that Java process. There is a little bit of the Java process comes up a little bit just to make sure that it is working fine. There is some internal activity on the back end, right, with the Java process. So it does make sure that it is working fine, and then it goes back to the sleep state. Okay. Now, to understand the number of threads which we have over here for this particular server, you can use this option, capital T over here. So this will tell you the threads for this particular JVM. Okay, so you can see that the number of processes is getting repeated. Basically, this means that these are the number of threads which you have running out there. So let's just do a calculation of it with WCFNL. So 137. So 137 including the processor, 136. So you have 136 currently active threads over here. When I say active, it means that it is on the system, but the thread states can vary, and I cannot say that from here what is the state of my thread. But I can say that there are 136 threads out here, which is currently part of your system. I don't want to say active. So let's just, that's basically your thread. So every time you have this kind of a process, like for example, garbage collection, right? Now, garbage collection, is a process which is handled internally by the JVM. But even then it is handled by internal service. It still needs to run on a thread, because anything which needs to be run as part of this JVM needs to be spinned up as a thread. And then that basic thread is going to have this information. It's going to have unique thread ID, which is basically the ID of your thread. And through the thread, you'll be actually able to track the threads, what kind of work it is doing, what state it is on. Likewise, you can get to know about the thread, and then you can see the state of the thread. Like as I told you, there are multiple states of thread which we will talk later about. And the objects is very important thing. Like, what is this thread about? So it's a short description of the objects this thread is handling, and the complete description as in task. Okay, so what is a detailed description of what this particular thread is doing? So that is going to be also available as part of your threads. All right. I hope that you understood what is thread and how it is used. Even in the previous few lectures about talking about your problem determination, we did see some of the threads. We did see the thread IDs. We did sort it by thread IDs as well. So likewise, it is very important for you to understand about threads. So that's one important topic which we want to talk about. In the next video, we have some interesting concepts which we will be covering as part of the thread in terms of thread issues. Okay, what are the probably the very frequent issues we are facing over threads? So we will talk about that on the next video. Thank you again for watching this. I'll see you on the next one.